Sounds good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar today. The topic I have for you is feeding cover crops to dairy cattle. And basically, it is a very complex topic, even though it sounds very simple, okay? So if we go back some years, a couple of my colleagues in Extension, Lisbon Versi and others, they put together a very nice survey through the North Central SARE. So basically they have 4 meetings as focus groups, to try to understand what are the concerns and what are the challenges that people foresee into using cover crops as a feed. Okay. Obviously, they cover a lot of different things with that survey and learn a lot of different things with that exercise. Today, we'll focus only on what are the potential challenges to feed dairy cows. Okay, but I highly suggest you to visit some of those results because there are other challenges associated with agronomic factors, storage of the material, and so on that I think is quite useful for those utilizing or planning to utilize cover crops. So if you think about dairy cows or dairy heifers, right, what were the major challenges that people mentioned related to using cover crops as a forage after corn silage? And one of the main issues was related to yields, okay? And could be 2 different scenarios. The first scenario was if you have very high yield a given year, okay, for the other forages that you utilize, like corn silage or alfalfa. So under those conditions, people were concerned that you would not want to use some of those cover crops as feeds, okay? Then a second issue was if you were planning to use cover crops, but the yields are limited, then you would end up in a case scenario where you would have to change diets later on, rebalance the diet, and so on, which is something that a lot of times we consider undesirable, right? Because if you think about the dairy cow, we always try to have consistency, right? The goal is to have a very consistent diet throughout the year and make sure that the cow can consume the same nutrients over and over, so production can also be consistent, right? Well, we cannot control yield, right? I'm sure my colleagues here can give you a very nice perspective on variations related to weather patterns. I don't fully understand that, so I'm not going to try, okay? But we know that yields vary drastically depending on forages that you are planting as well as the conditions of a given year. So if we cannot control for that, what can we control, right? So the other concern or the other major concern that was shared is that some of those cover crops actually have very high fiber content. And this is concerning because there is potential to limit dry matter intake of dairy cows because of rumen field. Okay? So if we think about it, basically, we know for many years that NDF concentration and digestibility are highly related to cow performance. If we go back 30 years and we double check this data set out of Michigan State, they learned that for every 1% unit increase in NDF digestibility, dairy cows have potential to produce 0.55 pounds per day more 4% fat-corrected milk. And this is highly related to an increase in dry matter intake, which for that specific review study was about 0.4 pounds per day for each percentage unit increase in NDF digestibility. Okay? Later, we also saw that if you're talking about corn silage specifically, okay, this first study was all forages related, so nothing is specific about cover crops or corn silage or alfalfa or anything else, okay? But for the second study, they focus on corn silage, and they saw that diets with more than 40% corn silage had a similar pattern in improvements in intake as well as performance with greater fiber digestibility. Okay. And I think that's quite important because at the end of the day, as we have more high-producing cows, making sure you have adequate digestibility truly allows you to end up with greater intake and consequently adequate performance. But the question is that truly an issue for some of the different cover crops that we could be using as a feed. So if you think from that perspective, nutrient composition of cover crops was evaluated in a study by University and co-authors some years ago. And basically what they did is they collected samples of rye and samples of triticale, and then they analyzed those either as a fresh forage or they ensilo those in the lab using mini silos, small mini silo bags. Okay, and they allowed those to ferment for 60 days so they could see if there was any pattern associated with that. Okay, so I selected a couple nutrients that they evaluated just to showcase, okay, so what is the typical or what was the typical nutrient composition for that study? And you can see that it's a very interesting nutrient composition here with about 13% protein or maybe 14% protein, depending if you are going through fresh or fermented. Okay? And actually, there is quite high NDF concentration, right? Obviously, it's close to 60%. And this should be, to a certain extent, concerning, right? Because if you think about corn silage, for example, usually we have about, I'm going to say 35, maybe 40% NDF, right? So if you simply replace one with the other, there is potential that the extra fiber you are providing could be actually a limiting factor, as mentioned by some of the participants of the study to understand challenges with feeding cover crops, right? However, if you pay attention to in vitro NDF digestibility, which here is related to the 30 hours, okay, before anybody asks me that, I know a lot of people here may like the 48, okay, but at the end of the day, they show the same thing, how digestible the feed is, okay, and that's how we compare. As far as you always use the same time point, you should be good to go, okay? So in this case here, if you use the 30 hours, which they use for that study, basically for all samples or the average for all treatments here, it was above 60%. And this is actually quite a very good number, you know, especially when you reach 67, 68% NDFD. Okay, that's actually corn silage. To reach those values would have to be very high quality. Okay, so from that perspective, yes, it is concerned the level of fiber in some of those cover crops, but I believe that based on this in vitro NDFD results, and also in some of this UNDF, which is the undigested NDF after 240 hours incubations, I think we shouldn't be too worried about the digestibility of those. Okay. Obviously, this is just nutrient composition, right? So we have to try to understand a little bit further than that to give you a better perspective on how do we feed dairy cows with those. But I think it's a very good point to say, hey, actually, it is a very digestible forage, so there is actually good potential to include in the diet. So currently, we are actually working on a follow-up study, also with the North Central SARE, and we are collecting, or we were collecting cover crops, okay, that are used by dairy farmers to different capacities, and we are trying to understand the variation with some of those. So this is a very preliminary data associated with this project, okay? And basically, you can see that similar to our previous data set, NDF concentration is also high, right? Especially compared with corn silage, right? But it's a little bit lower than the previous study if you pay attention to triticale and ryegrass in this specific table, right? And you can see that in vitro NDF digestibility is actually higher than the previous data set, which actually show us that there is very high potential to have very digestible forages when we are harvesting some of those cover crops as a feed. Okay. Now, the issue that I see with this data set that we have, even though it's a small data set, is that there is a lot of variation out there, right? So you can see that from farm to farm, there's a lot of variation in crude protein concentration of those feeds, right? Our standard deviation is around 2, which basically tells me that our range is, you know, it's more than plus minus 2 here, okay? So that's a concern because probably we are seeing in the field people harvesting those at a very different stage of maturity, or under very different conditions of growth, which change drastically the nutrient composition of those plants. And this is also true for fiber digestibility, right? Just a quick comment about fiber digestibility. If you go through our rye data here, you'll see that in vitro NDFD has a very low standard deviation, but that's just because we have 2 samples. Okay, so it may not be fully representative of what's going on. Okay, but I want you to be a little bit more careful with that and say, hey, actually, digestibility is again very high, so there is a lot of potential out there. And I do think that there is a space for cover crops to be added to dairy diets, okay? But the real question that we have to try to answer is, what is this space? Okay, and honestly, I don't think from a research perspective that we figure it out yet. Okay, I'm sure that some nutritionists have been feeding those for some years now, have a good perspective on those. But from a research perspective, we are still quite limited. And I think that's important to say because that initial study discussing challenges with cover crops make a very good point about that we lack feeding trials for some of those cover crops, okay? To my knowledge, there is only one study that is published and available. This is a study conducted at Penn State. And you may challenge me and say, but Luiz, I saw other studies with ryegrass or maybe triticale, and you would be right if you tell me that, okay? But the issue is a lot of those studies, they are not done when the crops are harvested as cover crops, okay? It's a different kind of scenario, right? We have to understand what those forages look like when they are used as cover crops, right? Because otherwise you may be feeding something from one perspective and you may end up in a scenario where actually the response is very different. So the only study that is available was conducted with 12 cows, okay? Those cows started the trial with about 40 days in milk. And basically they had 3 treatments. They had the control diet, which was primarily based in corn silage, okay? And then they replaced part of the corn silage with either triticale silage or wheat silage, okay? And basically, they had periods of 28 days, so the cows rotate across all 3 treatments, okay? So a given cow ate diet 1, then moved to diet 2, then moved to diet 3, okay? And they have all those mix going on. So all cows went through all treatments, so we could eliminate the animal factor. So here's the diet that those researchers utilized for this study. And you can see that is a very heavy corn silage diet, which about 44%. And then they replace around 10% corn silage, or exactly 10% corn silage, with either triticale silage or wheat silage, okay? They kept alfalfa haylage constant and all the other ingredients of the diet constant as well. So the only difference would be corn silage versus the other forage that they are testing, okay? And I think that's a nice exercise to try to understand, can we remove corn silage from the diet and include some of these different cover crops that are available out there? And if you think about it, so here is the nutrient composition of these diets. And basically you can see that by including cover crops, you actually increase a little bit crude protein, NDF, but you reduce the starch of the diet. So the real question is, what do cows say about that, okay? And for this study specifically, cows did not show issues with rumen feel, okay? Basically, dry matter intake was the same for all treatments, okay? However, I want to point out to you that this is a very short-term study, okay? 28 days sometimes is not ideal to see major differences in intake related to fiber digestibility. I still think that we should repeat this study to have a better perspective at a certain point, okay? But because of the changes in nutrient composition, in my opinion, especially the reduction in starch, okay, it led to a reduction in milk production, okay? So under those conditions, okay, you didn't see a benefit in feeding cover crops. They did not calculate efficiency of energy-corrected milk, so I calculated that. That's why we don't have a statistical analysis here, okay? But it was higher when you fed the typical corn silage-based diets, okay? However, I want to point out to you that I don't think replacing one ingredient is the way to go, Okay, I think replacing a combination of alfalfa and corn silage would be the best approach. And there are some simulations out there that support this claim, saying, hey, if you replace part of the alfalfa with some of the high quality ryegrass or high quality triticale, there's actually very good potential to even improve milk production. Okay. So implications for our presentation, cover crops do offer opportunities for diet formulation, okay? But a simple replacement one-to-one with forages without balancing the diet, similar to the study that we show you, is not the ideal way not to evaluate those cover crops or even feed those cover crops, because you have to actually adjust all the different nutrients associated with the diet. Okay. Another issue that we didn't discuss that was pointed out in that challenges exercise is that there is a huge need to focus on proper silage management practice to ensure adequate fermentation. And one thing that may come up in the future is having those cover crops available because of the nature of their fiber and the physical characteristics of those may actually be helpful and allow us to find shop corn silage, which is something that more and more we'll be targeting for. Okay. With that, I would like to thank you the opportunity of presenting today, and I'll be happy to later answer any questions.